In the year 1852, in a small settlement at the edge of the Kestrel Valley, Margaret Ellery buried her father on a gray Tuesday morning, with nothing left to her name but the clothes on her back, a Bible with her mother's handwriting fading in its margins, and a single iron key her father had pressed into her palm 3 days before his fever finally took him. "There is a house," he had told her, his voice already thin and rasping with the sickness that had settled into his chest that terrible winter, "built into the mountain above the old Cutler claim. I built it myself, Margaret, in the years before you were born, when your mother and I first came west, with nothing but a wagon and more hope than sense. I built it and sealed it, and told no living soul of its existence, save your mother, God rest her, and now you. This key opens its door. When the day comes that you have nowhere else to turn, you go to that house, and you will find that I did not leave you as unprepared as it might seem to you now." Margaret had thought, in the confusion and grief of those final days, that her father's mind had begun to wander, the way sickness sometimes carried a man's thoughts to strange and unlikely places. She had thanked him, kissed his fevered brow, and set the key aside among her few keepsakes, more concerned in those difficult hours with the practical business of surviving her father's death than with chasing some half-remembered story of a hidden house on a mountain she had never once, in 23 years of living in that valley, heard mentioned by name. It was the settlement's council, gathering a fortnight after the funeral, to settle her father's modest debts and determine what would become of a young unmarried woman, left with no property, no family, and no prospects beyond what charity the town might extend her, that finally drove her toward the key, and whatever truth or foolishness it might hold. "You may stay with the Whitfield family through the winter," the council's chairman told her, not unkindly, though the practical coldness of the arrangement was plain enough beneath his careful words. "Come spring, we will see about a position in service, perhaps in the town of Millbrook, where a respectable household is said to be seeking a girl of good character." Margaret had nodded and thanked the council for their consideration, understanding well enough that she had no standing to ask for better, but she had walked home that evening, if the Whitfield spare room could yet be called home, with a hard, cold resolve settling into her chest, the particular stubbornness of a woman who had watched her mother die when she was 12, her father die when she was 23, and had no wish whatsoever to spend the remainder of her days as a servant in some stranger's household, taking orders and living always at the margins of a life that properly belonged to someone else. She retrieved the iron key from among her keepsakes that same night, turned it over in her hands by candlelight, and found herself remembering, with the particular clarity grief sometimes lends to a dying man's final words, the exact conviction in her father's fevered voice as he had told her of the house on the mountain. She set out 3 days later, before the Whitfield family had properly noticed her absence, with a small pack containing what little food she could spare from her host's pantry without drawing suspicion, a woolen shawl against the mountain cold, and the key wrapped carefully in a handkerchief against her breast. The old Cutler claim, when she finally located it after a day and a half of careful, uncertain travel, had been abandoned for the better part of a decade, the family having moved on to richer land further west, and the mountain rising above it showed no obvious sign of any structure at all beneath its dense covering of pine and rock. Margaret spent the better part of a day searching the mountainside, growing increasingly convinced that her father's fevered words had indeed been nothing more than the wandering thoughts of a dying mind, before she finally noticed, tucked into a fold of rock that from any other angle appeared to be nothing more than a natural cliff face, the unmistakable seam of a door built directly into the mountain stone. Her hands shook as she fitted the iron key into a lock nearly hidden beneath years of accumulated moss and weather. And when the mechanism finally turned, with a grinding reluctance that spoke to years of disuse, and the door swung inward into darkness, Margaret Ellery stood at the threshold of something her father had spent years building and concealing. understanding, for the first time since his death, that his final words to her had not been the ramblings of a fevered mind at all. The house. Once Margaret had gathered the courage to light a candle stub from her pack and step properly across the threshold, revealed itself to be considerably more than the simple shelter she had half expected. A modest but carefully constructed dwelling of 2 rooms, built directly into the mountainside with a craftsman's evident care. The walls lined with shelving that held, to her growing astonishment, a store of preserved goods, tools and supplies that suggested her father had spent years, not months, in the careful assembly of whatever purpose this hidden place had been meant to serve. She found, in a chest set carefully near the small hearth, a collection of letters in her father's own hand, written across what appeared to be a span of many years, each one dated and addressed simply to "my daughter," whenever she should need these words. Margaret sat by candlelight that first night, reading through the earliest of these letters, with tears she could not fully explain even to herself, understanding, page by careful page, the full shape of what her father had done. He had built the house, the letters explained, in the years following her mother's death, when Margaret was still a child, too young to understand the particular vulnerability of a widower raising a daughter alone on the frontier, with no family nearby to offer protection or inheritance should misfortune befall him before she came of age. He had understood with a clarity Margaret found remarkable, given how little he had ever spoken of such fears in life, exactly how precarious her position might become. A young woman without property or family standing, entirely dependent on the charity of a settlement that owed her nothing beyond the barest Christian obligation. "I have watched too many women in this valley," one letter read, in her father's careful, deliberate hand, "left with nothing when a husband or father passes, forced into arrangements that trade their dignity for their survival. I cannot leave you land, for we have none beyond what the settlement itself might one day grant a married daughter through her husband's claim. I cannot leave you money, for what little I earn goes each season to keeping food on our table. But I can leave you this, a place that is yours alone, stocked and prepared, that no counsel or charitable family can take from you or use to bargain for your obedience." The letters continued across the years, documenting her father's careful, secret labor. Trips made under the pretense of hunting or trapping that had, in truth, carried him to this hidden mountainside to add another shelf of preserved goods, another careful repair to the structure's walls, another small store of coin saved and hidden against whatever future need his daughter might someday face. He had told no one, not even Margaret herself, until his final fevered days, understanding that a secret shared too early might be discovered, or worse, might tempt a growing girl toward a dangerous independence before she was fully prepared to claim it. "I do not know," the final letter read, dated only some months before his death, his hand grown noticeably less steady than in earlier years. "What circumstance will finally bring you to this door? Perhaps I shall live to see you married and settled, and this house will remain simply the quiet secret of an old man's careful worry, never needed at all. But if you are reading this because the worst has come to pass, if I am gone, and you find yourself with nowhere else to turn, know that I built this place with my own hands across many years, not because I doubted your strength, Margaret, but because I understood that even the strongest woman deserves somewhere to stand that belongs to her alone, when the world would otherwise leave her standing on nothing at all." Margaret wept properly that night, for her father, for her mother she barely remembered, for the years of careful, silent labor that had gone into this hidden gift, and for the particular loneliness of a man who had carried so heavy a worry for so many years without ever once burdening his daughter with the full weight of it while he lived. She woke the next morning to sunlight filtering through a small window she had not noticed the evening before, cut cleverly into the rock in a way that caught the eastern light without revealing the house's presence from any distance, and began, with a growing sense of purpose she had not felt since her father's illness first began, to properly explore the full extent of what he had left her. The days that followed brought Margaret a slow, careful understanding of exactly how thoroughly her father had prepared this refuge. Beyond the store of preserved food and the careful savings of coin tucked into a hidden compartment beneath the hearthstone, she found tools for a small garden plot cut into a sheltered clearing just beyond the house's hidden entrance. Seeds carefully preserved in oiled paper against the mountain damp, and, most remarkably, a small collection of books, practical volumes on animal husbandry, herbal medicine, and basic carpentry, alongside a well-worn Bible that had clearly been her father's own study copy, its margins filled with notes in his careful hand. She understood, working through these careful preparations across her first weeks in the house, that her father had not simply built her a shelter, but had attempted, across years of quiet labor, to equip her with everything a woman alone might need to build a genuinely independent life. Not the precarious charity of service in some stranger's household, but the harder, more dignified independence of a woman capable of sustaining herself through her own labor and knowledge. The settlement, when word eventually reached them that Margaret had not in fact remained with the Whitfield family through the winter as arranged, sent a small search party led by the council's chairman himself. More concerned, Margaret suspected, with the scandal of an unmarried woman disappearing into the mountains alone, than with any genuine worry for her safety. She met them at the mountain's base, having anticipated exactly this response, and explained, with careful diplomacy, that she had inherited a property from her father that she intended to properly claim and settle, though she offered no specific details as to its location or nature. A young woman cannot simply live alone on some unclaimed mountainside, the chairman told her, his tone carrying the particular paternalistic concern Margaret had come to expect from men who mistook their own comfort for her genuine welfare. "It is neither safe nor proper, Miss Ellery. I must insist you return with us and allow the council to properly settle your situation." "With respect," Margaret said, drawing on a steadiness she had not known she possessed before these past weeks of solitary preparation. "My father left me property and provision enough to sustain myself through honest labor. I have no wish to be a burden on this settlement's charity, nor do I require the council's permission to claim what my own father rightfully left to me. I will register the claim properly, through whatever legal channel the territory requires, but I will not be returning to service in another family's household." The chairman argued further, invoking propriety and safety, and the general impropriety of a woman living alone without a husband's protection. But Margaret held firm, and eventually, faced with her evident determination and the practical difficulty of forcing a grown woman into service against her expressed will, the search party departed, promising to return should she reconsider, or should hardship eventually force her hand. She did not reconsider. Through that first difficult winter, Margaret worked the careful preparations her father had left her, tending the small store of supplies with careful economy, learning, through trial and considerable error, the practical skills the books had only partially prepared her for. She was not wholly alone. An elderly trapper named Josiah Cole, who had known her father years before, and had apparently been sworn to a distant, watchful discretion regarding the hidden house's existence, checked on her periodically through that first hard winter, offering practical advice on matters her father's careful books had not fully anticipated, though he never once suggested she abandon her independence for the safety of the settlement below. "Your father spoke of you often, in his last years," Josiah told her during one such visit, warming his hands by her small hearth fire. "Worried more than most men worry about what would become of a daughter he could not properly provide for through ordinary inheritance. I told him more than once that he underestimated you. Seems I was right to say so." It was in the second year of her residence at the mountain house, her small garden plot finally yielding a proper harvest, and her practical skills, grown considerably more capable through a full cycle of seasons, managed largely alone, that Margaret first encountered the man who would eventually become the second great turning point of her unlikely story. Thomas Ashford arrived at the base of her mountain in the autumn of her second year, a surveyor employed by the territorial government to properly map and register claims across the region in advance of the railroad's anticipated expansion. A task that had brought him, quite by accident, to the previously unregistered boundary of what Margaret had, through the careful legal process Josiah had helped her navigate, finally claimed as her own recognized property. He was, Margaret found upon their first careful, wary meeting, considerably more respectful of her independence than the Settlements Council had ever managed to be, treating her ownership of the mountain claim as simply an unremarkable fact to be properly surveyed and recorded, rather than a scandal requiring correction or explanation. "Your father built well," he told her, some days into the careful survey work that necessity required him to conduct across her property. Having by then seen enough of the house's hidden construction and her own careful management of its resources to form a genuine professional respect for what he was observing. "I have surveyed a great many claims across this territory, Miss Ellery, and I have rarely seen land managed with such careful, deliberate foresight, whether by man or woman." Their acquaintance, born of practical necessity as his survey work required repeated visits across that autumn and into the following winter, grew slowly into something considerably warmer than either had initially anticipated. Thomas, finding himself drawn to a woman whose evident capability and quiet independence stood in marked contrast to the more conventional matches his professional travels had occasionally presented him. Margaret, finding herself, for the first time since her father's death, genuinely enjoying the company of another person, rather than simply managing the practical business of her own survival. "I confess," Thomas told her, during one such visit as the second winter's snow began accumulating around her hidden mountain home, "that I did not expect, arriving in this territory to survey claims for the railroad's benefit, to find myself considerably more interested in the particular claim belonging to Miss Margaret Ellery than in any of the dozen other properties my work requires me to properly document." Margaret, who had spent 2 years building a fierce, careful independence specifically to avoid the kind of precarious dependence her father had feared for her, found herself weighing this evident affection against every hard-won lesson those years alone had taught her. "I have built a life here," she said carefully, "that belongs entirely to myself. I will not trade that independence for a marriage that simply transfers my dependence from a settlement's charity to a husband's authority, however kindly meant that authority might prove to be." "I would not ask you to," Thomas said, with an earnestness Margaret found herself, despite her careful caution, genuinely believing. "I have watched you these past months manage a property and a life that most men in this territory could not have built with twice the resources your father left you. I do not wish to diminish that accomplishment by asking you to set it aside for the sake of conventional marriage. I would ask instead whether you might consider a partnership, my own modest savings and surveying income joined to your evident capability and this remarkable property your father so carefully prepared, built as an equal arrangement rather than the kind of ownership marriage typically grants a husband over his wife's property and person." Margaret took considerable time to properly consider this proposal. Understanding, through the careful independence her 2 years alone had taught her to value above nearly everything else, exactly how much she stood to risk should Thomas's evident respect for her autonomy prove, once legally bound by marriage, to be merely a courtship pretense rather than a genuine lasting commitment. She consulted, in the weeks that followed his proposal, with Josiah Cole, whose long friendship with her father and careful watchfulness over her own independent years had earned him a trust she extended to few others in that territory. "Your father," Josiah told her, considering her careful questions with the particular thoughtfulness she had come to expect from him, "built you this house so that you would never again need to depend on any man's charity or authority for your own survival. That does not mean he would have wished you to live out your years entirely alone, Margaret, if a genuine partnership presented itself. He built you independence, not isolation. There is a difference, and I believe he understood it well." She traveled, eventually, to the territorial capital herself, a journey Thomas helped arrange, but did not accompany her on, understanding with the same evident respect that had first drawn her toward him that she needed to make this particular arrangement on her own careful terms. she consulted with a lawyer regarding the specific legal protections available to a married woman under territorial law. Learning, through careful and occasionally frustrating research, of the recently established provisions allowing a wife to maintain separate legal ownership of property she had held prior to marriage. Protections considerably more generous than the common law traditions still dominant in the older eastern states. She returned to Thomas with a specific, carefully considered proposal of her own, that any marriage between them would be conducted under exactly these separate property provisions, that the mountain house and its surrounding claim would remain, by explicit legal agreement, her own property, regardless of their marriage, that any children born to their union would inherit that property through her line specifically, rather than through any general claim of marital community property that might otherwise complicate her father's careful intentions. "I would not have it any other way," Thomas told her, upon hearing these careful terms, with an earnestness that finally fully convinced Margaret of the genuine respect underlying his affection. "Your father built this place to ensure you would never again be at the mercy of another's authority. I have no wish to become, through marriage, exactly the kind of authority he built this house to protect you against." They married the following spring, in a modest ceremony attended by Josiah Cole, a handful of neighbors from the growing settlement below who had, over Margaret's years of evident independent success, come to regard her with considerably more respect than the council's original paternalistic concern had suggested, and conducted, at Margaret's specific insistence, in the small clearing before her mountain house rather than the settlement's church. A deliberate symbolic choice that Thomas fully understood and readily accepted. The years that followed brought Margaret and Thomas a life built, quite deliberately, on the foundation her father's careful, secret labor had first established. The mountain house, expanding gradually, as Thomas's own modest carpentry skills, developed alongside his surveying work, allowed them to add rooms and improvements to the original structure. The garden plot growing into a proper working farm as their family grew. The careful legal protections Margaret had insisted upon, ensuring that every improvement and expansion remained explicitly recorded under her own name, a provision Thomas never once contested or resented across their many years together. Their children, 3 daughters born across the following decade, grew up knowing the full story of their grandfather's careful, secret preparation, Margaret making certain, in a deliberate echo of her father's own careful letters, that each daughter understood exactly why the mountain house existed and exactly what independence it represented. Not simply an inheritance of property, but an inheritance of the hard-won understanding that a woman's security should never depend entirely on the goodwill or authority of others, however kindly meant that authority might prove. "Your grandfather," Margaret told her eldest daughter, some 15 years after that first fevered deathbed conversation, had first set her unlikely story in motion. The two of them working together in the garden that had grown across the years into something considerably more established than the modest plot her father had originally prepared, understood something that took me considerable time and hardship to fully learn myself: that the truest gift a parent can leave a child is not simply property or money, though those matter considerably. It is the careful, deliberate preparation that allows a child to stand on her own feet, regardless of whatever misfortune the world might otherwise visit upon her. She thought often, across those years, of her father's final fevered words, of the particular loneliness he must have carried through years of secret labor, never once speaking of his careful preparations until his final days, understanding, with a father's particular worry, exactly how precarious his daughter's position might become, should he not live to see her properly settled. She understood, watching her own daughters grow into a security and independence her own early years had never possessed, exactly what careful sacrifice that secret labor had actually represented. Years of a widower's modest earnings set carefully aside rather than spent on his own comfort. Careful trips made under pretense to avoid revealing his true purpose. A burden of worry carried silently rather than shared, out of a careful, deliberate wish to protect his daughter from premature knowledge that might have complicated her ordinary childhood. Josiah Cole, grown considerably older across those years, but remaining a welcome and honored presence in Margaret's household until his own passing in her 38th year, told her once, during one of his final visits, that her father had asked him, in the earliest years of the house's construction, whether he thought his careful secret preparation was perhaps foolish. An old man's excessive worry over a daughter who might, after all, grow up to marry well, and never need so elaborate a provision. "I told him," Josiah said, "that a father's careful worry over his daughter's safety is never foolish, however elaborate its expression. I told him that even if you never needed that house, Margaret, the building of it would have been worth his labor, simply for the peace it gave him, knowing he had done everything within his power to protect you against whatever misfortune might come. I did not know, telling him that, quite how right I would prove to be." Margaret Ellery Ashford lived to see her 3 daughters grown and married themselves, each marriage conducted, at her own careful insistence, under exactly the same separate property provisions she had first negotiated for her own union with Thomas. Each daughter inheriting not simply property, but the hard-won understanding of independence her grandfather's careful secret labor had first established on that mountainside so many years before. She died in her 63rd year, in the same mountain house her father had built with his own hands, surrounded by daughters and grandchildren who understood, through careful family tradition passed down across generations, exactly what an old iron key had once opened, and exactly what kind of love had built the house, waiting patiently behind that hidden door.